Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing abrupt climate change. We seem to have gotten a bit, we had a couple days of a heat respite here, although the sun is out today. There's no marine layer, there's no clouds, so it seems to be warming up quite quickly. It is currently 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and getting warmer. I want to start with a story that I saw the other day. I didn't get a chance to talk about it, but then it seems to be ongoing and perhaps escalating. Red tide algae. Florida declares a state of emergency as red tide kills animals and disrupts tourism. This is from yesterday. The Washington Post. Florida's toxic algae bloom is killing marine life. This summer, a toxic red tide is responsible for killing wildlife in Florida. Florida's governor this week made official what residents of Southwest Florida already knew. The bloom of toxic algae that has darkened Gulf waters is an emergency. The red tide has made breathing difficult for locals, scared away tourists, and strewn popular beaches with the stinking carcasses of fish, eels, porpoises, turtles, manatees, and one 26-foot whale shark. Governor Rick Scott, a friend of the earth, and I'm joking, late Monday declared a state of emergency in 7 counties stretching from Tampa Bay south to the fringe of the Everglades. Scott promised $1.5 million in emergency funding. The governor is facing Senator Bill Nelson, Democrat, this fall at the ballot box in a contest for the Senate seat Nelson has held for 3 terms. Each man has accused the other of failing to tackle the red tide calamity and the simultaneous bloom of a different type of algae that is clogging rivers and canals and putting a scum on top of Lake Okeechobee, which I did cover a few weeks ago. Citizens in retirement communities are reporting respiratory distress from the vapors of the microscopic red tide organism called Karenia brevis. A recent study found a 50% spike in hospital visits due to respiratory problems during red tide blooms. The red tide has been gradually moving north to the mouth of Tampa Bay, according to state tracking data. For many places, the daily reports continue to say watercolor dark and respiratory irritation intense. Worst of all are the reports that state dead fish heavy. Rick Bartleson, a research scientist with the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, said water samples offshore show lethally high concentrations of algae. There's no fish left. Red tide killed them all, he said. All of our concentrations of red tide are still high and would still kill fish if they were out there. The algae is found in marine environments for most of the year, but the past 2 months have produced high concentrations, said Kelly Richmond, a spokeswoman for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. The duration of blooms can be affected by sunlight, nutrient, and salinity content, she said. Toxins can aerosolize in the wind that drifts ashore, triggering respiratory problems or worsening conditions such as asthma. That has incited many tourists and some locals to flee. Sea turtles have been hit hard, with more than 300 dead from the red tide in the affected counties. And there's a picture of this whale shark on the beach. I can't even let my cats out on the lanai, said Amy Ernst, a Sarasota printmaker who lives near the beach. Eyes burning, throat burning, sinus problems. Adrian Maselli Trask, 52, a salon owner who helped organize the Hands Along the Water protest in Sarasota, said, "It's not just on the beach, it's in our intercoastal waterway, it's in the air, it's toxic. Somebody's backyard in intercoastal is totally filled with dead fish. It's disgusting." Scientists are trying to figure out why exactly the recurrent red tide along the Gulf Coast has been so protracted and deadly. I wonder why. State officials and scientists point out that at base, this is a natural phenomenon. Fish die-offs were noted by Spanish explorers in the 1500s and have been well documented since the 1840s, but the incidences of red tide seems to have increased since the 1950s and 1960s. I wonder why. Climate change could be a factor. Warmer waters up to a certain point are congenial to algal growth. The Gulf of Mexico's surface temperature has warmed by about 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1977. There's a more direct human handprint on the current crisis. Florida's landscape and the flow of water have been radically altered by agriculture, canals, ditches, dikes, levees, and the sprawling housing developments that have sprouted as the state's population has boomed. Bartleson said Lee County used to be 50% wetlands and is now about 10% wetlands. In the old days, he said, rainwater slowly filtered into the aquifer or seeped into estuaries. Now it rushes rapidly, unfiltered, into rivers and bays and into the Gulf, typically loaded with agricultural nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus, which feed the algae. Hurricane Irma struck the state head-on last September, and the red tide bloom began about a month later. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was forced to release massive amounts of nutrient-laden water from Lake Okeechobee to prevent the overtopping of the venerable Hoover Dike. Those nutrients fueled green algae in the inland canals and rivers and flowed through the Caloosahatchee River into shallow waters along the Gulf Coast. It is plausible that fueled the red tide bloom. Some scientists hesitate to declare a direct cause and effect. I feel like Kevin Nealon, you know, the guy that was on Saturday Night Live, and he used to have like Freudian slips and he would correct himself immediately. Anyways, though Bartleson said of the current red tide, it's on steroids with our nutrients. Researchers have experimented with ways of killing the toxic algae, but they are proceeding cautiously because they don't know what effects it could have on the ecosystem. Corenia brevis algal bloom is made up of millions of tiny single-cell plant-like organisms, and like many plants on land, they produce chemicals as a defense. One of these weapons is the brevetoxin compound. The ocean has thousands of species of algae, really only a little bit more than 100 that produce toxins that are dangerous to us, said Don Anderson, the director of the U.S. National Office for Harmful Algal Blooms, based at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Algae in general are hugely important to marine life. Historically, algal blooms become more prevalent in the fall and decline in late winter and spring. Less rainfall and increased wind could potentially ease this deadly red tide. For now, there's no end in sight. Not good. And moving to an article from The Guardian. Extreme temperatures especially likely for the next 4 years. Cyclical natural phenomena that affect planet's climate will amplify effect of man-made global warming, scientists warn. This is from yesterday. The world is likely to see more extreme temperatures in the coming 4 years as natural warming reinforces man-made climate change, according to a new global forecast system. Following a summer of heat waves and forest fires in the northern hemisphere, the study in the journal Nature Communications suggests there will be little respite for the planet until at least 2022, and possibly not even then. Actually, not even then. Rising greenhouse gas emissions are steadily adding to the upward pressure on temperatures, but humans do not feel the change as a straight line because the effects are diminished or amplified by phases of natural variation. From 1998 to 2010, global temperatures were in a hiatus, quote unquote, as natural cooling from ocean circulation and weather systems offset anthropogenic global warming. But the planet now has entered almost the opposite phase when natural trends are boosting man-made effects. Everything seems to be adding up, said the author of the paper, Florian Sevelec, of the French National Center for Scientific Research. There is a high possibility that we will be at the peak of a warm phase for the next couple of years. Oh boy. And we are supposedly entering another El Nino. The scientist built his forecasting system by statistical hindcasting. This crunches the data from previous climate models to measure which combination was most effective in predicting past temperature trends. Based on this analysis, Sevelek said the statistical upward nudge from natural variation this year is twice as great of that of long-term global warming. Next year, it is likely to be 3 times higher. Whoa, uh-oh. He cautions that this should be seen as a prediction that Europe will definitely have more heat waves, the US more forest fires, South Africa more drought, or the Arctic more ice melt. The likelihood of these events will increase, but his model is on a broad global scale. It does not predict which part of the world will experience warming or in which season. But his data clearly suggests that water in the oceans will warm faster than air above land, which could raise the risks of flood, hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones. I like to pronounce cyclones like that. Natural variability is a wriggle around the freight train. That is global warming, he says. On a human scale, it is what we feel. What we don't always feel is global warming. As a scientist, this is frightening because we don't consider it enough. All we can do is give people information and let them make up their own mind. He said his model should not be seen as the final word, but be taken alongside other forecasting systems on sweating, including those that look in more detail at what is happening on a regional level. Dr. Sam Dean, Chief Climate Scientist at New Zealand's National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research, said the paper indicated mankind will have to rely less on the fortuitously cool years from natural processes. Instead of the cooling La Niñas experienced in the first decade of the century, he said there have been more warming El Niños since 2014, and this trend looks set to continue. Yes, referring to Guy McPherson's video, which I linked. We're, I guess, apparently in the third El Nino event in 4 years. It's going to be, I mean, when the heat just starts coming out of the water, when the carbon just starts getting released from the water, it's just, there's no El Nino or La Nina. There's just a constant El Nino. And hold on to your hats when that becomes the norm. Other scientists praised the paper because concurred on the need for a wider analysis. The findings suggest it's more likely we'll get warmer years than expected in the next few years, but their method is purely statistical, so it's important to see what climate models predict based on everything we know about the atmosphere and the oceans. Those are more expensive to run, but also use more climate physics and observational information. If the warming trend caused by greenhouse gas emissions continues, years like 2018 will be the norm in the 2040s and would be classed as cold by the end of the century. Oh yeah. If this summer is classed as cold, that means very bad things. And moving on. Jakarta, the fastest sinking city in the world. This is an interesting article. I don't know how deep I'm going to get into this, but this is from the BBC from yesterday. The Indonesian capital of Jakarta is home to 10 million people, but it is also one of the fastest sinking cities in the world. If that goes unchecked, parts of the megacity could be entirely submerged by 2050, said researchers. Is it too late? It sits on swampy land, the Java Sea lapping against it, and 13 rivers running through it. So it shouldn't be a surprise that flooding is frequent in Jakarta, and according to experts, it is getting worse. But it's not just about freak floods. This massive city is literally disappearing into the ground. The potential for Jakarta to be submerged isn't a laughing matter, said Harry Andreas, who has studied Jakarta's land subsidence, or subsidence, whatever you like, for the past 20 years at the Bandung Institute of Technology. If we look at our models, by 2050, about 95% of North Jakarta will be submerged. It's already happening north of Jakarta, has sunk 2.5 meters in 10 years and is continuing to sink by as much as 25 centimeters a year in some parts, which is more than double the global average for coastal megacities. Jakarta is sinking by an average of 1 to 15 centimeters a year, and almost half the city now sits below sea level. The impact is immediately apparent in North Jakarta. In the district of Baru, an entire office building lies abandoned. It once housed a fishing company, but the first floor veranda is the only functional part left. The submerged ground floor is full of stagnant floodwater. The land around it is higher, so the water has nowhere to go. Buildings that are so deeply sunk are rarely abandoned like this because most of the time the owners will try to fix, rebuild, and find short-term remedies for the issue. But what they can't do is stop the soil sucking this part of the city down. An open-air fish market is just a 5-minute drive away. The walkways are like waves, curving up and down. People can trip and fall, said Ridwan, a Maru Baru resident who often visits the fish market. As the water levels underground are being depleted, the very ground market goers walk on is sinking and shifting, creating an uneven and unstable surface. Year after year, the ground has just kept sinking, he said, just one of the many inhabitants of this quarter alarmed at what is happening to the neighborhood. North Jakarta has historically been a port city, and even today it houses one of Indonesia's busiest seaports, Tanjung Priok. Its strategic location near the Siliwangi River flows into the Java Sea was one of the reasons why Dutch colonists chose to make it their bustling hub in the 17th century. Today, 1.8 million people live in the municipality, a curious mixture of fading port businesses, poor coastal communities, and a substantial population of wealthy Chinese Indonesians. Fortuna Sophia lives in a luxurious villa. That's a great name, Fortuna Sophia. The sinking of her home is not immediately visible, but she says cracks appear in the walls and pillars every 6 months. We just have to keep fixing it, she says. Standing beside her swimming pool with a private dock just a few meters away, the maintenance men say the cracks are caused by the shifting of the ground. She's lived here for 4 years, but it has already flooded several times. The seawater flows in and covers the swimming pool entirely. We have to move all our furniture up to the first floor. Good God. Every year the tide gets about 5 centimeters higher. None of this has deterred the property developers. More and more luxury apartments dot the North Jakarta skyline regardless of the risks. The head of the advisory council for Indonesia's Association of Housing Development, Eddie Ganefo, says he has urged the government to halt further development here. But he says so long as we can sell apartments, development will continue. The rest of Jakarta is also sinking, albeit at a slower rate. In West Jakarta, the ground is sinking by as much as 15 centimeters annually. By 10 centimeters annually in the east, 2 centimeters in central Jakarta, and just 1 centimeter in South Jakarta. Coastal cities across the world are affected because of rising sea levels. Somebody just sent me something about an island off of Virginia. It's all sinking, people. Alaskan coastlines, Louisiana coastlines, South Florida coastlines, South Carolina coastlines, Virginia coastlines, Jakartan coastlines, Bangladesh, India, China. I mean, they're all sinking. Coastal cities across the world are affected because of rising sea levels caused by climate change. Thank you for being direct about that statement. Increased sea levels occur. You're good. You're fine. Just steer. You're good. You're okay. It may seem surprising. The increased sea levels occur because of thermal expansion, the water expanding because of extra heat. And the melting of polar ice. The speed at which Jakarta is sinking is alarming experts. Breaks. It may seem surprising, but there are few complaints from Jakartans because For residents here, the subsidence is just one among a myriad of infrastructure challenges they have to deal with daily. And that is part of the story of why this is happening. The dramatic rate at which Jakarta is sinking is partly down to the excessive extraction of groundwater for use as drinking water, but for bathing and other everyday purposes by city dwellers, piped water isn't reliable or available in most areas, so people have no choice but to resort to pumping water from the aquifers deep underground. But when groundwater is pumped out, the land above it sinks as if it is sitting on a deflating balloon, and this leads to land subsidence. The situation is exacerbated by lax regulation, allowing just about anyone from individual homeowners to massive shopping mall operators to carry out their own groundwater extractions. Everyone has a right, from residents to industries, to use groundwater, so long as this is regulated, says Harry Andreas. The problem is that they take more than what is allowed. Of course they do. People say they have no choice when the authorities are unable to meet their water needs, and experts confirm that water management authorities can only meet 40% of Jakarta's demand for water. Problem? A landlord in central Jakarta, known only as Hendry, runs a dormitory-like block called a kos-kosan and has been pumping his own groundwater for 10 years to supply tenants. He is one of many on his street who do this. It's better to use our groundwater rather than relying on the authorities. A kos-kosan like this needs a lot of water. The local government has only recently admitted it has a problem with illegal groundwater extraction. But what about when this groundwater becomes undrinkable or unusable, I wonder? Then what? In May, the Jakarta City Authority inspected 80 buildings in central Jakarta's Jalan Thamrin, a road lined by skyscrapers, shopping malls, and hotels. It found that 56 buildings had their own groundwater pump and 33 were extracting water illegally. Authorities are also hoping that the Great Garuda, a 32-kilometer outer seawall being built across the Jakarta Bay, and I'm glad they were talking about this because I was going to say they're building a giant wall. But if the water is coming up from the ground or the land is sinking, good luck with that. Outer seawall being built across Jakarta Bay along with 17 artificial islands will help rescue the sinking city at a cost of about $40 billion. It's been supported by the Dutch, and just stop. It's been supported by the Dutch and South Korean governments and creates an artificial lagoon in which water levels can be lowered to allow the city's rivers to drain. It will help with flooding, which is an issue when the rains come. Yeah, but 3 Dutch nonprofit groups released a report in 2017 which cast doubt on whether the seawall and artificial islands could solve Jakarta's subsidence problem. Jan-Jaap Brinkman, a hydrologist with the Dutch Water Research Institute, Deltares, argues it can only ever be an interim measure. He says it will only buy Jakarta an extra 20 or 30 years to stop the long-term subsidence. There is only one solution, and everybody knows the solution, he says. Leave the place. That would be to halt all groundwater extraction and also leave the place. That would be to halt all groundwater extraction and solely rely on other sources of water, such as rain or river water or piped water from man-made reservoirs. He says Jakarta must do this by 2050 to avoid major subsidence. How's it going to work if they only can supply 40% of the water to the people? Where in this equation does any of this add up? It is not the message that is being taken to heart yet. And Jakarta's governor, Anies Baswedan, thinks a less drastic measure will do. He says people should be able to extract groundwater legally as long as they replace it using something called the biopori method. This involves digging a hole 10 centimeters in diameter, and I can only imagine where this is going, and 100 centimeters deep into the ground to allow water to be reabsorbed into the soil. Critics say the scheme would only replace water at a superficial level, whereas in Jakarta, water is often pumped out from several hundred meters below ground level. There is technology to replace groundwater deep at its source, but it's extremely expensive. Tokyo used this method known as artificial recharge when it faced severe land subsidence 50 years ago. The government also restricted groundwater extraction, and businesses were required to use reclaimed water. Land subsidence subsequently halted. But Jakarta needs alternative water sources for that to work. There you go. Harry Andreas from Bandung Institute of Technology says it could take up to 10 years to clean up the rivers, dams, and lakes to allow water to be piped anywhere or used as a replacement for the aquifers deep underground. Jakarta's residents adopt a somewhat fatalistic attitude to their future in this sinking city. Living here is a risk, says Sophia Fortuna, or Fortuna Sophia, whatever her name is. The people here have all accepted that risk. All right. Good luck, Jakarta. One moment. Well, seeing as I have a limited amount of time left in my afternoon, I am going to wrap this video up now. I very much appreciate the very generous contributions I have received over the last couple of weeks. Thank you, thank you. That always helps. Thank you for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so with the links below, and I will most likely be back tomorrow with another video. Until next time, peace.